All right, let's get going. So today we're a little bit ahead. We're going to cover the future of IPM instead of what we were going to talk about, which I think was challenges to IPM, because we kind of touched on that and a couple other things, and this touches on it as well. So just as far as announcements are concerned, a reminder that the monitoring labs are due this week. So Tuesday groups today, Thursday groups on Thursday. I see your report. That's what I like to see. All right. And just get them to me during lab or after class, just so long as I get them. You can give me a hard copy, or you can email them if you want. I don't think there's anything that physically needs to be attached. So
you like email me as well?
Sorry?
You can email them to you? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Again, lab will be at Bayer Crop Science. I recommend that if you have a tablet or a laptop computer, bring it along, because we're going to do data input and some analysis. And hopefully we'll have enough time that we'll basically do all the analysis, and so you can, during the course of the lab, make all your tables, all your figures. We'll basically isolate out what the effects are. And so when you're writing the report, you'll have all of that done already, which will make things nice and easy. We are truly at the end of the semester. There are only 2 more lectures left for this class. On Thursday, we'll be covering some IPM case studies, so looking at actual applications of IPM. And then on the last Tuesday, we'll have a review session. Because the final is semi-cumulative, you know, about 80% material from this third of the semester and about 20% from the other stuff, we'll be basically covering some of the bigger ideas in IPM that we covered at the beginning of the semester. And then, yeah, just a reminder, the final exam is on Tuesday, May 16th. It's not at our usual time. It starts at 1:15, and you get the standard 2 hours for it. Any questions on all of this? All right. So I've got a couple questions about this. I know some of you are kind of rip-roaring, eager to take the PCA exam. Maybe you have a job lined up and they want you to get your PCA license. Or maybe you want one to make yourself a little more marketable. The main thing is just a reminder that to take the PCA exam, you need to have passed this class with a C or higher. And so usually when you register for the test, they're going to ask you for a transcript or some sort of evidence that shows that you have passed it. So the tricky thing is, if you want to get that PCA exam out of the way right away, this class is not going to show up on your transcript, right? Because we still have a little bit of work to do. So what we got here are the basic schedules for the upcoming PCA exams. And so you see the date of the exam and then the filing date. And you'll notice the filing date is generally 1 month in advance of the exam. So if you want to take, say, the Salinas test on the 14th and 15th of June, you're going to need to have all of your transcripts and stuff turned in by the 13th. Now, since faculty members aren't required to have grades in until the 26th of May, this transcript's not going to have your final grade on it, which makes things kind of tricky. So if you are planning to take the test, what you can do is you can send an email to the degree advising office and ask them for a letter saying that you have passed the actual course. So if I have submitted my grades, then they'll write you up a special letter saying such and such has received a C or higher in this course, and they'll send it off to the office for you and notify them. On the flip side, if I haven't submitted my grade yet, they'll contact me and I can say whether or not I think you're going to have a C or higher, which for some of you will be more certain than for others. And because we have a whole bunch of relatively large assignments coming here at the end, it might be kind of hard to determine. So generally, your safest bet is really to wait until this test in Sacramento. Your grades will definitely be available on your transcript by the 15th of June, but that still means you have to wait until the 15th of July to actually take the test. So, yeah. Any questions about this? All right. So basic idea is you can contact the degree advising office, and they can help you out if you want to take a test earlier than that. But this is always kind of a problem we have at the ends of the semesters. All right. So Future of IPM. This is kind of broadly looking out at where IPM is going and the fact that while IPM is kind of the current paradigm, there's still a lot of improvement to be made in pest control. And so essentially, whatever, things are changing, right? This is the basic idea. Nothing is static. There's always new crops, new technologies, new pests, all showing up all the time. And then on top of that, we've got some bigger things like change in the climate that are going to have huge implications for how pest control is done in the future. And so flexibility is really going to be the name of the game moving forward. And so it's kind of this question that I was curious about was, well, IPM right now is substantially different from how it was maybe even 10 years ago with the introduction and the widespread use of, say, GMOs. So what are things going to look like, say, 10, 20 years out in the future? And as far as I can tell, there are three major areas that are going to be addressed. I think one of the big ones is this question of people are going to start really looking at IPM and saying, does IPM actually work? Is IPM going to be a useful paradigm moving forward? And the main reason I bring this up is it's already kind of in the works with Jim Farrar up at UC IPM. He's already commissioning reports where they're looking at IPM, trying to figure out if it works. There's going to be a lot of changes in pest biology associated with climate change, probably also changes in how we do growing. And that's also going to change substantially in California when we start looking at changes in regulation around groundwater and nitrogen budgets, and the fact that more or less you're going to have to budget for everything moving into the future, not just your pest control. So that's going to make things a little tricky. And then finally, just the fact that I think down the road we're going to see a lot more impact of genetic technologies on pest control. I just saw an article. It was just on Reddit. One of the top hits was about a new CRISPR application that they had used to clear HIV out of adults. And so these are powerful techniques, and people are definitely interested in using them in pest control. And so it'd be interesting to see where those go. So let's talk about how we can tell if IPM actually works. And so just to jump back, in the history of IPM was established about, say, 58 years ago with the publication by Stern et al. Of really what is the first IPM paper, the integrated control concept, where they basically established IPM by saying, we should really try to integrate chemical and biological control so we're not killing our natural enemies all the time. And we should also figure out when we need to treat and not spray any times other than that. So they basically established the idea of integration and economic thresholds. And this sort of design really was inherently focused on that individual field-by-field control decision that we talked about last week during the area-wide control. And so this was really well directed at individual farmers, PCAs, sort of that approach to pest control. And this has really been the focus of IPM ever since this publication came out, is how can we provide sort of really well-established, really balanced pest control programs that are basically on par with chemical sprays, that have the same sort of cost and efficacy against pests as chemicals, while being maybe more stable and reducing the amount of resistance we see. And so by the late 2000s, researchers started really looking at this paradigm and saying things like, yeah, that's great that we've been doing IPM since the 1960s, essentially, but does it actually work? And so people started digging into the literature, looking around, and what they were a little surprised to find was that it's not entirely clear that IPM does work really well. And there were some cases, basically, where they found that IPM does work really well. There are these really obvious successes. So a really good example is citrus in Australia. I've got two examples from Australia. One really good, one not so great. And by not so great, I mean a complete failure. So in citrus is being grown in Australia for a long time, but they had some issues in the 70s and 80s with a lot of introduced scale pests. California reds, white wax, circular black, and white louse scales. And they were bad enough that more or less they had established resistance to all of the chemicals, and there wasn't really any other sort of control available. So consequently, the Australian Agriculture Office implemented an IPM program where they established some treatment thresholds. And the significance of those treatment thresholds was that they weren't based entirely on the pest, but they were also based on biocontrol monitoring. So you'd go out, you'd measure the number of pests, you'd measure the amount of biocontrol, and you had sort of a treatment decision that accounted for both of those aspects, so that you wouldn't spray if you had a lot of biocontrol, but you would if you lacked it. They also invested in a lot of research looking at classical biocontrol agents, so shipping people off to California to look for things like Aphytis malinus that can be used to control California red scale, and also in finding cover crops that hosted predatory mites, so ways to keep your biocontrol in the field. And this ended up being a huge success. They went from about $552 per acre worth of control down to $133, so a 3/4 reduction in the total cost. And almost all these benefits were derived from having less insecticide applications. So substantial reduction in chemicals, huge amount of what is essentially free control, because once you establish the biocontrol, it more or less stays there. Right, and also they found that with newer pesticides that were introduced, they had a lot less resistance problems. And more or less this has been chugging along for like 2 decades now, just going along fine. So it's kind of like they put it in place and it works really well on forever. On the flip side, Australian cotton was an example of a big IPM failure. So Helicoverpa zea, actually a variety of Helicoverpa species were introduced to Australia and started feeding on cotton. This guy's a cotton bollworm, which you may remember from IPM. These guys burrow into the bolls, feed directly on the cotton itself, so you have huge losses. Now, so in 1980, the Australian government established this treatment threshold program in order to sort of take another IPM approach. And so they established treatment thresholds, they mandated pesticide rotations so that you wouldn't repeat applications over and over again, and they also created a really fancy, and by fancy I mean 1980s fancy, so like punch cards and floppy disks and stuff, computer program that was designed to figure out when would be the ideal time to do applications and to help farmers make those decisions. Now this just basically completely failed. Every single chemical they threw at these Helicoverpa species, they evolved resistance to very quickly in spite of mode of action rotations. Spinosad was a really great example. They introduced that, and they were doing a single application every year, and there was resistance developed within 3 years. So basically, most growers got to apply it 3 times, and then it didn't work anymore, and arguably didn't work real well in the first place. And so due to all this, control costs just kept going up. Now, I know it's on the slide, but can anyone guess what late 1990s technology came along and bailed out all the cotton growers in Australia? Maybe not. 1996, Monsanto released a certain cotton product. Yeah, BT, right? In the late 90s, BT rolled along and basically bailed out the whole industry. The mods didn't quite have an answer to this, and so they rolled it out. Helicoverpa problem disappears. But essentially, had BT not come along, they would still be out of luck, is the idea. So IPM really failed to solve the problem in this case. And so through a bunch of these studies, people started asking, well, why is it that in some cases you have really good IPM? You establish a bunch of, say, biocontrol or really good thresholds, and you never have the problem again. And why is it that some of them just never work, even from the outset? And so they identified some key factors that had to do with these IPM programs. The first one was, and this is going to sound like area-wide control, but you need to have high buy-in from growers. More or less, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good if you're doing IPM if your neighbors aren't, because you might be reaping personal benefits from rotating your modes of action, but if everybody around you is spraying the same chemicals over and over and over again, they're just going to select for resistant pests that will move into your field later. Similarly, complex IPM tends to do better than simple IPM. So if you think of that spectrum we talked about, moving from sort of biologically and moving from things that are non-intensive, right? Biologically simple, relatively easy for growers to use, all the way up to biologically complex. Programs that end up on that complex side have lots of multifaceted approaches, tend to be much more sustainable in the long run than those simple ones. And then finally, some of it just has to do with pest biology. If you've got a pest in a perennial crop, it doesn't move around much, so pathogens, weeds, scales, things like that, they're easier to control because that investment you put in with those resistant rootstocks, with those cover crops, things like that, they hang around for a long time. And so you get a big return on that investment, whereas if you're plowing up your field every year, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to invest heavily in a lot of these sort of things like beetle banks and the like. So on the flip side, unsuccessful programs tend to just have the opposite. We've got low buy-in from growers, so you have lots of people free riding, trying to get the benefits without doing the work. You've got really simple IPM. Generally, if your IPM program is mostly based on thresholds, it's not really sustainable in the long run. And then finally, if the pest is highly mobile, polyphagous, meaning again feeding on multiple plant species, or highly migratory, it's not going to work. Because whatever control you do in your field may provide control on that individual group of the population, but if they just basically fly right in after you've done your little application, then you're basically at square one. And so the two major factors they identified as areas that we need to improve IPM moving forward were we needed to address the fact that there are cases where you have low grower buy-in, and you also needed to address the fact that some pests are just biologically not suited to IPM in a field-by-field context. That there are some pests like Helicoverpa that IPM in an individual field just isn't going to stop. So, as far as selling growers on IPM, this is kind of an ongoing problem. The reality is that when you're trying to basically sell any control program, what growers typically want is they want tools that are inexpensive and low risk. When we talked about selling IPM programs, we kind of got into the details of how you can sell programs as far as building up trust, demonstrating that these techniques work. But again, you're always going to come down to this problem of risk and expense. And so with this, you get kind of these really cynical definitions of IPM. That this is Puente et al. 2001, which is that IPM is the cheapest thing that kills pests at the moment. And that's more or less the reality in a lot of cases. It's whatever works and whatever is most inexpensive and available at the time. And generally, this translates down to scouting and economic thresholds. Whereas, many of these most effective tools really require more of an investment. And so generally, this is just an uphill battle. How do you convince a grower that it is in their best interest to do these variety of approaches that will provide them with long-term control? Well, in the end, it's kind of difficult to do it without some sort of incentive, some sort of way to reduce that cost or to balance out the amount of damage that they are afraid that they might accrue from relying on this instead of, say, a chemical approach. So as far as pests not being suited to field by field, we talked about this in area-wide control. But there's the idea that some pests, like pathogens and weeds, might be relatively easy to control in a field. So are scales. But as soon as you have a migratory pest where you basically can spray a chemical, but then they'll just migrate in after it's dissipated, you kind of are just, essentially taking morphine for a broken leg. You feel better in the short term, but if you keep walking on it, it's never going to heal up. You're never going to solve the underlying problem that you have, which is that you have all of these Helicoverpa hanging out in the area. And Helicoverpa is a really nice example of this kind of problem pest. And essentially, it feeds on just about every crop that's out there. And so you're going to have a certain amount of it in the environment no matter what, just depending on who's growing what. It's highly mobile, so it can move in from those reservoirs quickly, and it's migratory. So you might not have it in the overwintering period, so any sort of treatments you do then won't really matter. It'll just migrate up from some other location. And yeah, so for these, traditional applications don't really work. We need to treat them outside of the crop. And so the takeaway here is this idea that IPM is going to have to move away from this field-by-field approach and into sort of more of an area-wide treatment, where we treat the total population over a period of generations. And I'm not going to belabor this point because we already covered it in area-wide control. But again, just the basic idea that this addresses a lot of major concerns. Primarily the idea of grower buy-in, that since most area-wide control programs have some sort of incentive program, tax breaks, reduce costs on the specific equipment or chemicals you need to carry it out, this sort of reduces the perceived risk of the actual approach. And then finally, because we're covering all habitats and not just our individual fields, this reduces a lot of the threats associated with pests that are poorly suited to field-by-field IPM. And the nice thing about area-wide control is that we in California are really well set up to already use it. There are already a handful of programs in place, like the Medfly, Bullworm, and ACP programs. And the reality is that control decisions are already decentralized from the grower in a lot of cases. Oftentimes, a PCA is in charge of any sort of decision in the first place, so they can make decisions or at least work to convince a grower of the benefit of going in on an area-wide program. And also, in California, we have a lot of really nice, big, active commodity groups. And they generally understand that it is in their best interest to organize these kind of programs. And so oftentimes there are people who will organize them individually as sort of a group of growers, and so they know what the growers need, sort of what are the constraints for getting them on board, and then also can kind of crack the whip and get all their membership to line up and to do the program. So area-wide control seems to be the area where we are going. So a challenge that we didn't talk about yet would be the idea of where we expect the climate to go in California with sort of impending climate change, or climate change that's already in action. Being that, short review, right? Greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide and methane, get released into the atmosphere. They trap heat close to the surface of the Earth and generally raise temperatures. And as these temperatures raise, we see sort of widespread changes in the climate across the entire Earth. Now, in the San Joaquin Valley, we expect these changes to be relatively acute in the area of just sort of the amount of rain that we get, as well as just the amount of hot days that we're going to suffer. So they're expecting about a 2.5 degree Fahrenheit jump within the next 20 years within this area. And while that might seem like a relatively small impact, the actual impacts on the climate are expected to be relatively substantial. We're talking 2 to 4 times more heat wave days over the course of the summer. Dry years are expected to increase as well, anywhere between a 50% jump up to a 150% jump. And on top of that, we're generally just expected to have less water overall. So when we do get water, it's expected that we will have less of it. Excuse me. And overall, all these things kind of combine to be hotter, altered growing seasons with less available water.
If we did have the water, would that be an advantage to have more carbon dioxide and hotter, warmer areas to have more vigorous growth in plants?
Mm-hmm. So we'll touch on that.
To a degree.
To a degree, and we'll touch on it in just a minute. Because yeah, you're right. So on one hand, plants love CO2 and they like heat. And so that can help with plant growth. Certainly there have been experiments. Well, you know what, we'll touch on it later. We're going to get there. And so with a lot of modeling of this climate, there's been a general approach just to sort of try and determine, what areas are going to be most vulnerable to these changes. There was a study recently looking at total agricultural vulnerability with, here's a nice map of California, with areas that have high vulnerability as red and those with low being blue. As you can kind of see, we've got kind of a nice a nice sort of red through light orange streak going right through the middle of the Central Valley. So we're looking to be in an area that is going to be relatively stressed with these changes in climate, as well as sort of the Imperial Valley. The areas where you see that are blue tend to be areas that aren't particularly agricultural. So they'll be okay. It's not going to help the growers out in California very much, though. So, what does this mean for IPM? There are obvious implications for growing. So if you're limited in water, you're dealing with higher temperatures, slightly altered growing seasons, there are really clear implications. It's going to be, in some cases, more challenging to grow plants. Maybe it'll open up Central California to different crop varieties that couldn't grow here before. Maybe it'll push some of them out. Maybe we'll just have to come up with new irrigation regimes. Those are all kind of beyond the scope of this class. Hopefully that's been covered somewhere else. But California is very innovative. Agriculture is oftentimes very innovative. I'm sure there will be solutions that will be come up with. But so what does this mean for IPM? What can we expect from a pest control perspective? Well, the general range, and perhaps the most general trend, I'd say probably the most obvious, is that we should expect that pest ranges are going to shift. And generally, pest ranges are going to shift towards the poles. So in California, that means their ranges are going to be pushed a little further north. If you're in South America, they're going to be pushed a little further south. But generally, the pests are going to follow their ideal temperatures upwards towards the North Pole. And as a consequence of this, pests may be moving from areas where they have sort of lots of biological control built up, lots of natural enemies. They may be moving up into areas where those aren't very well established. And they may have a brief period where they are released from those controls, and we have lots of pest outbreaks. Now, I would expect that the biocontrols are going to follow the pests as well, because their range is going to shift too. But sometimes things don't happen perfectly in sync. Maybe you get a pest before biocontrol, maybe the other way around. And further, as they move up, we may have pests that are going to encounter crops that they haven't seen before because they are moving into new ranges, which could cause sort of some interesting new pest problems. However, the individual trends that we expect to see are going to be different between the major pest categories because clearly the different pest categories have different biological needs. So we're going to address those individually. So as far as insects are concerned, the real key here is all based on degree days. Insects develop faster as temperatures increase until you hit sort of a thermal maximum. So if climate change is going to make things generally warmer, we expect insects to develop faster. We expect them to undergo more generations per year as temperatures increase. And so we expect insect pests to show up in the fields a little bit earlier, and we expect them to show up in larger numbers overall. Generally, if the winters are mild, we expect more of them to survive the winter cold periods, so that initial inoculum should be a little larger. That's not such a big deal in California, but when you move to areas with very severe cold winters, we expect more insects to survive them. So Midwest, Pacific Northwest, we expect there to be more pests. And sort of an aside from this is the fact that lots of insects have what we call a minimum flight temperature. So essentially, they won't fly until a certain temperature is reached during the day. And so if we have higher temperatures normally, we expect the insects to start migrating earlier in the day, thus making them migrate further. So they might expand the range in which they migrate, which would be problematic for pests that usually overwinter in a very selective site and then migrate out into the fields later, like aphids. And so in one case, climate change has already been linked to a range expansion in the mountain pine beetle. So these are the beetles that are killing the trees in the Sierra Nevada right now. Now that doesn't have to do with the range expansion so much as it has to do with the drought. But these pine beetles, their range is here in red. So you can see we have the United States and Canada. Have someone hit the lights in the back? This will be a little more clear. Oh, can you hit the lights? Yeah, all of them. It's still not clear, but I'll try and outline it as best as I can. So traditionally, mountain pine beetle's been kind of limited as far as northern bounds up to sort of this southern edge of Canada, because the winters get too severe up there and they just can't overwinter and establish large populations regularly. But as the climate has been heating up and as sort of winter temperatures have been declining, the beetle has moved up substantially into the northern reaches of British Columbia. And the major problem with this is that a lot of the trees in British Columbia are not adapted to the mountain pine beetle. They don't have any evolutionary history with the species. So they don't have as much defensive compounds as the trees do here in California. And so the beetle's really running amok up there.
I laugh because you really can't tell there's any resistance to those beetles in this area.
No, not with the drought, right?
Well, there's actually 3 beetles that are infecting these trees.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them carries the blue fungus.
Right, and there are some invasive beetles that do, have a little bit of an extra sort of kick in the pants to trees and have, like the blue fungus that can cause more of a virulent reaction. I'm going to group these beetles, group them generally. But so they move into this area, they don't have much resistance, and they're also, in many cases, just as drought stressed as the trees are out here, because they have suffering drought. So we're seeing massive amounts of tree death up here. And now, what's arguably the most serious problem with this is that when the beetles were essentially limited to southern Canada, they couldn't really get over here to the eastern forests because they were limited by the Great Plains. They couldn't actually navigate this broad area of southern Canada or the western United States because there's no trees there. And this did not show up on the picture, that's too bad. So in this picture, what we've got here is essentially you've got a big plain where there's a lot of agriculture in Canada, and then right up here north of my cursor, this is all boreal forest that these beetles can feed on. And so you can sort of see they're already starting to snake along. There's a lot of fear that they're just going to travel through this forest and end up over in the eastern forests on the eastern seaboard and potentially cause a lot of trouble over there as well. So a relatively small change in temperature seems to have allowed the beetles to expand pretty dramatically. As far as general trends, there's some people who have done a fair bit of studies looking at whether we expect to see different amounts of damage between the different types of insects. And the general consensus, at least of some papers, is that we expect beetles and hemipterans to become a larger pest problem, generally because feeding on sap or feeding on roots is going to always be problematic, and so if you have large populations, they'll cause more damage. And they're suggesting that while lepidopterans will have larger populations and will consume more, that's going to be offset to a certain extent by the fact that the plant is just going to produce more tissue. And since most leps feed on leaves and odds and ends like that, and by odds and ends like that, I mean leaves, stems, things like vegetative growth, they may eat more, but it's going to be offset, whereas you can't really replace sap or roots. So as far as pathogens are concerned, it's really hard to make broad, overarching guesses about how pathogens will function, because generally they are so sensitive to the environment. So it's possible that you'll have climate change in such a way that it favors certain pathogens, while other ones are going to be left behind. The general trends that are expected, though, is that any pathogens that are vectored by insects will increase because we're expecting to see more insects in the system. So viruses that are vectored by aphids, expect to see more of them floating around, just because we have more aphids. In addition, it's expected that with extra CO2 in the system, that fungal spores will be produced in larger numbers, so fungi might be more of a problem. But then on the flip side, if we're expecting the summers to be drier, we're expecting more drought years, then we really expect there to be a lot less fungal problems because they are so dependent on availability of water in the system. So, basic idea here is that pathogens require a lot of very specific sort of ecological things to be in combination in the exact right way for the disease pyramid, triangle to establish itself. And so without all of those things in line and with sort of the unpredictability of how the environment will change, it's really hard to figure out exactly what this impact is going to be. So weeds. General trend in weeds is that we are expecting to see, much like insects, range expansions. Weeds are temperature sensitive as well, especially to cold temperatures, limiting their range. And so as temperatures increase, we expect them to move further north and also to start climbing up in elevation. So weeds will have more success in foothills and mountain-type habitats. So there's been some studies looking to model how weeds will react to global climate change. They've looked at, this one study I found looked at yellow star thistle and leafy spurge and saw some interesting stuff. So basically what they did was they had quantified the kind of habitats that these two weeds like to live in, and then they took a map and they basically said, well, what areas in the western US match that habitat? What are some potential areas where they could live? And then they carried out a variety of climate models that would look at how those habitats would change over time. They wanted to see how much of the US is going to basically match this weed's requirements after climate change. So they created this projection map. And what we've got on this map here is the western seaboard of the United States. In black, we have the current range of the yellow star thistle. And in white, we have all of the potential range of the star thistle. And this is just under current sort of climate conditions. So in the future, what we have is black being, essentially we have a color map just showing the risk. So black being areas that are very high risk of infestation. And then all the areas with these little diagonal stripes out here are new areas that are opened up to the weed, where they couldn't live before, but now with climate change, these are areas where it can survive. So you can see it's expanded pretty far east, out even to the edges of the Great Plains, that there is a lot more areas that are available to the thistle. On the flip side, when they looked at leafy spurge, though, we see in the original map that they have a pretty wide area that they can infest, although they are a little bit limited. Again, black dots being where the leafy spurge is, white being where it could move to. And this map's a little hard to read. But essentially what my point is that a lot of those regions that were white are now that really light gray color, meaning that they're hard to infest. And we don't see any of those diagonal stripes that would be new areas opened up to the weed. So under this model of climate change, leafy spurge actually reduces its range. A lot less of the habitat is suitable to them, primarily because it's expected to be a fair bit drier in these regions. So for some weeds, we're expecting this range expansion, but depending on the sort of individual conditions in the areas, we might see contractions. So general idea is, much like with pathogens and insects, a lot of this stuff is going to be kind of case-by-case basis, and we're just going to have to wait and see. Do you have a question?
The star thistle, so is that saying that the star thistle seeds go way up and they'll go over the Rocky Mountains? Or is that like they'll be planted over there?
The idea here is not so much that they definitely will be, like it's not necessarily that seeds will be thrown over or that people will plant them, but it's the idea that those habitats previously, if we had distributed seeds there, if we were to go today, pick a whole bunch of thistle seeds and go to, say, Nebraska and throw them on the ground, the climate wouldn't be suited for them to establish. They would probably die out. But they're saying in about 50 years, with current climate change projections, you could go there, throw those seeds, and they could establish. So just the idea that these are areas where, there's a lot of potential for infestation. And then finally, there are some concerns that climate change may actually aid herbicide resistance in weeds. And so this gets at that idea we were talking about right at the beginning, I said I'd address later, that the more CO2 you put into the system, the better plants grow. So here we've just got a guy who is growing Christmas trees inside plastic enclosures with different concentrations of CO2. So at ambient CO2, an additional 150 parts per billion, 300, then 450. And you can just see the difference in the size of these conifers as you add CO2 to the system, that these plants are just growing much faster and much more vigorously.
But that doesn't represent the change in temperature as well.
No, it does not.
Because as the temperature increases, increases and the CO2 increases, these plants are less likely to process the CO2 and go dormant or even die off, perish.
Okay, so you think the temperature and the CO2 will sort of offset each other?
Well, in C3, we just learned this in aspects of crop production.
Oh, and with C3.
Plants will do better with higher levels of CO2 and low temperatures.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then you have that. But then the C4 plants will do better with higher temperatures and lower levels. So there's a trade-off.
Sure.
It's based on respiration rates and water loss.
Mm-hmm. So I guess it's going to depend on what that temperature range is for the plant. If the increase in temperature is going to push them, is going to be, I guess it's kind of a question of how much of a detriment is the temperature compared to the advantage of the extra CO2. You know,
Vice versa.
yeah, exactly. Is it going to be a large enough decrease in growth due to temperature that's going to offset that CO2? Or is it possible that you're going to get such a boost from CO2 that the relative loss from that temperature change is going to be minimal? But
The location too.
yeah, and location. So this is a general idea that with research that CO2 generally contributes to factors that aid herbicide resistance. So increased leaf thickness, so harder for herbicides to penetrate, less stomatal openings, generally less uptake from the soil through the roots. So generally things that will aid in herbicide resistance is the idea. But as has been pointed out, it's kind of hard to read the crystal ball and to make a lot of generalizations. That there may be specific cases where there are trade-offs associated with temperature versus CO2 versus location.
Well, there's basically only three kinds of plants. You got C3, C4, and CAN plants.
Mm-hmm.
And C3 and C4 are our crop plants, not the CAN plants.
Right.
So it's already been concluded that increased CO2 and high temperatures are detrimental to plants.
And that's sort of
And
universal
one,
across the board?
You're going to have both,
All right.
right? I mean, you're going to have both increased temperatures and increased CO2 levels.
Okay. Well, I might have to take that up, revise my slides. This is, which course was this?
Aspects of crop production. Talk to Dr. Shrestha.
Shrestha? I'll talk to Dr. Shrestha. Certainly. All right, so where was I? Yeah. So the final word, just sort of to summarize, we expect that generally across the board, climate change is most likely to expand pest ranges and increase their rates of reproduction and development. And so generally we're looking at pests to move around and to have more generations. And generally the idea of IPM is that it's just going to need to continue to be flexible to address these changes. All right, so biotechnology, sort of the last one. Bet we can get through this. So increasingly, GMOs and technologies I've talked about in class a little bit, Riddle, CRISPR, I didn't touch on RNAi, but that's something that's going to be coming along as well. These are all technologies that control pests based on specific genetic manipulations, either manipulating the genetic code of the host plant so that it is not hospitable to the pest, or manipulating the genetic code of the pest directly so that they can no longer survive in the system. And generally, I think the major challenge here is just that pest control professionals are going to need to identify where these fit into these IPM systems and also hold on to the different approaches that we have, the cultural, the biological, and the chemical approaches that we already use in IPM, and make sure they get integrated in a useful way so that we don't just go in all whole hog for genetics. And this sort of follows the general consensus that I've been hearing from other IPM professionals, which is that genetic technologies are another tool that's part of the toolbox, not sort of a panacea. Perhaps the best example of genetic technologies being integrated into control would be something like BT crops, that generally people treat them as if they are just resistant cultivars, even though at their very heart they are a completely novel product that doesn't really behave entirely like a resistant product or a resistant crop variety. But generally, you get sort of a similar reaction that you have decreases in insecticide applications and increases in biological control. So these are some surveys done in 2008, 2009, looking at BT crops. We've got cotton here on the left, and we've got corn on the right. And we see this general trend that with these genetic technologies, we have a reduction in the amount of insecticide that is applied, and we have an increase in the amount of yield. Now, there are some cases where you don't reduce the insecticide or you don't increase the yield, but it still is a net economic benefit because you end up with one benefit in the area, one area or another. And similarly, when BT cotton was first introduced to China, they were monitoring the amount of sprays as well as the amount of biological control in the system. And when they saw a general decrease in the number of insecticide treatments per year after BT was brought in, they also saw an increase in the amount of biocontrol left in the field because you generally weren't spraying the biocontrol directly, you were getting the dose of BT by consuming the plant. So, just to move things along since we're running out of time, major pitfalls is that on one hand, genetic technologies may not fit really well into traditional IPM formats, in which case we might have to throw some IPM out the window in order to get them into the system. I think this is a relatively minor concern, being that most of these technologies are being introduced either as sprays or as modified plants, and so they kind of fit into the system pretty well, either in the paradigm of pesticides or of resistant plants. Probably the bigger concern would be that we could have a situation kind of like DDT after World War II, or the introduction of glyphosate with Roundup-ready crops, which is that if genetic controls are inexpensive and highly effective, people might just go in 100% for them and kind of throw out other technologies. And these are not foolproof technologies. There's always the possibility for resistance among pests, even to genetic approaches, and it has been demonstrated that they can evolve resistance to genetic approaches. So, something we should watch out for. Right. And then further, when you're releasing genetic material into the environment, you can't really pull it back. As soon as you put a gene out there, it is out in the environment. And so we need to be exceedingly careful since we don't necessarily know what all of the environmental or health effects of these technologies are. All right. And it also just brings up some really interesting ethical questions too. So with technologies like riddle and gene drive, we can not just suppress populations, but if we put a genetic drive into the system, we could potentially eradicate entire species from the face of the earth, at least in theory. And so it kind of raises these interesting philosophical questions like, if we have the ability to eradicate a pest species, should we eradicate a pest species? And if we did decide to do so, then who makes the decisions on what pest species get eradicated and which ones don't? And if it's relatively easy to engineer this, then how do we stop people from eradicating some species that they just don't like?
Mosquitoes should be
Fleas.
number one.
Sorry?
Mosquitoes should be number one.
Yeah,
Fleas should be number one.
fleas, mosquitoes. Yeah, there's a lot of conversation around this. They've been talking about this at the ESA meetings for the last 2 or 3 years, and the general consensus, as I see it, is that a lot of people are very opposed to the idea just because they don't like the idea of completely eradicating something. But then on the flip side, they're maybe okay with eradicating an invasive species that's not from the area originally. So maybe something like wiping out some of the invasive malaria mosquitoes or taking out Asian tiger mosquito in the United States, which transmits West Nile virus, with the idea that it doesn't belong here in the first place. It's not an important part of a whole lot of ecosystems. You know, it transmits diseases. Maybe we could get rid of it. And then finally, I think it raises an interesting question, which is how much genetic modification are customers and consumers willing to accept in their food? So just like organics really came out as sort of an alternative to conventional pest control that was so heavily invested in chemicals, makes me wonder if there will be new markets that open up for non-genetically modified crops or crops that have nothing to do with any sort of genetic modification technology. And yeah, could genetic technologies ever become a major tool if people react so violently against these genetic technologies in the first place? So, where does IPM go in the face of all of this? I think the primary thing to keep in mind is that IPM is the predominant paradigm right now, and it doesn't look like it's going anywhere, at least not right away. The fundamentals of the process still resonate with a lot of people, whether you're a grower looking for an efficient way to raise food or an environmentalist who's concerned about environmental quality. But at the same time, IPM is not being used to its fullest potential. Shifts to address climate change, genetics, and area-wide control will hopefully make pest control more efficient.